Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, to be asked to speak on this issue, which I agree wholeheartedly with Timo that this is arguably the most pressing issue in Europe, and it speaks to many of the most pressing issues around the globe. It's a crisis that is, in the first instance, I would say, it's a humanitarian crisis. It doesn't have to be a crisis. When we think about it in comparative perspective, the numbers of refugees we're talking about in Europe are not a lot in comparative perspective, but it is nevertheless a very big political crisis, and it can get bigger. So I want to talk a little bit about what it is that's driving this humanitarian crisis and a crisis of European values. So I want to begin by talking about what I think is the contours of this crisis as a humanitarian crisis, what we're talking about, before turning to analyze a bit the political dynamics. The political dynamics that are producing, exacerbating what I consider a toxic ideological climate. A toxic ideological climate that makes dealing with the refugee situation in a humanitarian and rational way very difficult. So I want to talk about the pieces of this, particularly at the level of the political process, but then also talk a little bit about this question of European values and why it is that this populist, this right-wing xenophobic populism is rising, how it has managed to render latent racist and xenophobic attitudes very salient, dangerously salient politically, salient in a way that is first and foremost dangerous for the people who are dying trying to get into Europe, but also for the European Union itself. So let me talk about this piece by piece. Before finally turning the floor over to my friend and collaborator Jihad Hami, who is a refugee himself, a refugee from Kobane, who spent 2 years in Turkey and has been in Germany for a year now. And I think one of the telling issues of the problems in Europe with dealing with this refugee crisis is so frequently there are panels and discussions and public debate in which there are no refugees involved in the debate, and refugees are framed as either demons or at most victims, but the perspectives of the refugees themselves are not taken into consideration. So hopefully we can make some progress in this room at least, and I wholeheartedly agree as well with your important comments about the obligations, the moral obligations that we all have. This is a very diverse room, but we're all here in Europe, and public opinion in Europe is ultimately about European citizens and things like this, and this has to do with fighting those fights at the dinner table with your relatives and your families to get people to understand what we're talking about when we talk about this as a crisis of European values. So just at the outset, to talk about what I mean by a crisis of European values, let me just cite, or perhaps it's a crisis of European self-image, because there's a deeper history in which the European attitudes are quite in accordance with things that Europeans have stood for historically, but there was a hope that this was something in the past. And that hope is linked into the values of the European Union. Article 2 of the 2008 Lisbon Treaty, something close to the European Constitution, it says that the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. This stands in blatant contradiction to the reality, and the reality is Europe stands at the center of what is effectively a walled world. A world which has been, I think, provocatively but incisively described as a situation of global apartheid, in which people are fleeing from disastrous situations that are frequently largely caused, not only caused, but also caused by greedy and short-sighted and aggressive policies of the rich countries. So this is a question of justice. justice, and it's a question in which those of us who are in this country are in the European Union are all relatively privileged insofar as our ability to move around this world. But the reality is that for many people, and it's not just a European phenomenon, but it is also a European phenomenon. For many people, the ability to move around is a privilege or an aspiration, and not a right. So we have what we've been witnessing over the past couple of decades, and that has accelerated very much in the last in the last decade, in the last couple of years in particular, is a construction of a fortress in Europe, and this is happening in Europe. It's happening all over the world. In fact, even in South Africa, we see similar kinds of dynamics vis-a-vis people trying to come from less fortunate places in Africa. You certainly see it in North America with Donald Trump's one policy proposal is to build a wall. So this this idea of building a wall, Israelis as well, build a wall. So we build a wall and we create a fortress so we can stay safe from these problems. And what that means in effect is when you build a fortress, you make it very difficult for people to get in. And people are fleeing from very disastrous situations frequently. And so they're fleeing for rational reasons. And when you build the wall, you make it very difficult for people to get in. And this has costs in terms of human lives. And so what do I mean? So this is a map showing from a couple of years ago, and there's actually been several thousands of deaths since. But the Mediterranean in particular is the deadliest frontier in this world, this walled world. It's the deadliest frontier. In the last 2 decades, over 20,000 people have died trying to cross the Mediterranean to get into the European Union. And the more that we build fences, and the more that we construct this fortress, the more costly in terms of human lives we're making this. And so this is a crisis that, as I say, that can be traced back 2 decades, and it's something that is accelerating very much in the last several years. With just the last 3 years, we see fatalities in the Mediterranean. 3,279 people died trying to get into the European Union in 2014. Up last year to 3,673 people dead, and so far this is about a month old now, I believe. 3,500 through September of this year died trying to get into the European Union, fleeing from desperate situations. With respect to this issue, put this in a comparative perspective. It is the deadliest and most dangerous frontier in this global, to use that analogy of global apartheid, in this walled world of global apartheid. It's not the only place that people are dying trying to flee into these safe havens, so to speak, but it is the deadliest. And what are we talking about in terms of arrivals and in terms of deaths? So we see the western part of the Mediterranean crossing. 62 people have died. 3,800 have been reported arrived. The much more attractive for people fleeing is the central and eastern Mediterranean routes, where we have seen about 130,000 arrivals in Italy and 167,000 arrivals in Greece, with over 3,000 dead trying to get in the central route, and another close to 400 trying to get across this eastern route. Now, when I say that building the fortress, one of the things that's interesting here is that in the West there's so few people trying to get across and dying getting across, and this is linked to the effectiveness of the fortress that has been built going back 10 years on this western fringe, which has pushed people into other places. And so when you build the wall, and what we see is a dynamic where a wall is built in one place, and so then a different route is taken, because in fact there are multiple routes that people try to get into Europe to flee from bad situations to a better life. In fact, the easiest way for people to get in remains through airports, and this is the safest way. But in order to get onto the flights, these are people who are relatively privileged. So the people who are least privileged, most in need, are put in difficult situations. And the more that we build walls, the more we give incentives to people like human traffickers to use a kind of entrepreneurial skills, so to speak, to figure out ways that are more costly to people in terms of their human life. But there are many, many routes, and it's very difficult to imagine effectively sealing an effective fortress for Europe. And even if it could be done, it would be very counterproductive in terms of the stability of the near neighborhood in Europe. So that the question in the political debate in Europe is so frequently posed as whether or not refugees, but it's not a question of whether or not refugees, it's a question of where refugees, and if it were possible to seal off very effectively Europe, it would mean more refugees in the near neighborhood. Places like Turkey, places like Lebanon, places like Jordan, even the failed state Libya itself, places that have a lot more difficulties in terms of their resources, and if it causes problems of stability in Europe, the richest countries with the most state resources, you can imagine the kinds of effects that this could have. And in the longer term, this is not rational for the Europeans either to have a near neighborhood that is unstable and up in flames. So let me continue by framing this issue with respect to when I say that this is a crisis in terms of a crisis of European values, a humanitarian crisis. The first point I want to make is that it's a global crisis. And Europe is an epicenter of, as I say, this humanitarian part of the crisis. But the global crisis is a refugee crisis around the globe. We see, these are numbers from 2014, and the numbers are higher still now. 59.5 million forcibly displaced people. This is the highest number of forcibly displaced people in the world since the Second World War. About 19.5 million of them are refugees. Another 38.2 million of them are internally displaced people. And there's about 1.8 million asylum seekers. So that's the numbers that we're talking about, and the numbers in Europe are actually quite low, but we'll get to that. So in the end of 2014, where are these refugees coming from? About half of the refugees in 2014 were coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, Central African Republic, Iraq, and Eritrea are the top 10 countries from which people are fleeing, and this is about 70% of the refugees at the end of 2014. And where are they going? Largely, they're going to the near neighborhood, as I say. So Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan. So this is a map that shows where the big numbers leaving are the red, and the big numbers receiving are in green. And let it be known that of the top 10 refugee receiving countries, none of them are European countries. So we're talking about Jordan hosts currently 2.7 million refugees. Turkey, 2.5 million, Pakistan, 1.6 million, Lebanon, 1.5 million, Iran, close to 1 million, Ethiopia, another 700,000, Kenya, another 500,000, Uganda, another 500,000, the Democratic Republic of Congo itself, another 383,000, and Chad, another 370,000. And so these are numbers that put to shame the numbers of refugees that we're talking about, even in the most generous of the European countries, Germany and Sweden, so to speak, we have much lower numbers. And so in fact, 86% of the world's refugees are hosted by countries that themselves are developing, classified as developing countries. So what this means is countries that have less state capacity, state resources, and have difficulties with political stability themselves because of the well-known relationship between between wealth and stability. So the numbers at the global level, I think, need to be put into consideration, because so often in the United States and in Europe, this is considered as an issue of charity on the part of the Europeans, but this is a question of justice. It's a question of distributive justice with respect to state capacity, who's going to deal with these people, who's going to able to meet these people's needs, but it's also a question of justice when we think about the causes of the crises from which people are fleeing, the causes of state failure from which people are fleeing. But as I say, the European authorities, for the most part, have been acting in accordance with a reflex, which is politically conditioned, a reflex to build a wall. We saw this last year. Last year, when in the summer of last year, there were several highly publicized shipwrecks where hundreds, and in fact, I think 1,200 people died in 1 week. And this then became very salient politically. The European leaders come together. Their plan of action is a plan of action which, again, is this reflex of a policing reflex, a build-a-wall reflex. So there was a 10-point action plan. I just want to focus on 3 of these points. A systematic effort to capture and destroy vessels used by smugglers is one of them. So attack the smugglers and the traffickers, okay, has been one of this, along with member states being forced to ensure fingerprinting of all migrants, as well as looking for ways to increase collaboration, often with tyrannical police apparatuses on the other side, and as well as trying to move for return programs to places outside of the fortress. Okay. So let me just say a couple of things about the main problems with this way of trying to deal with the political process, the political problem. This targeting on traffickers in particular is, I think, Curtis Dobler has very eloquently put the limits and the problems with this trafficker targeting kind of approach. When he says fixes for the European migration crisis, especially those involving the use of force, are merely likely to take more lives rather than save them. The correct response demands much deeper consideration. Until European states and the United States and their allies look at the root causes of migration and refugees, refugees being a subgroup of migrants, and adequately address them, we could talk about that, this question of the relationship between migration generally and refugees. But until they look at the root causes and adequately address them, this European migration crisis will merely intensify. The current strategy of building barriers to migrants will only stimulate the creative migrants and traffickers use to circumvent the obstacles they face. Meanwhile, the question of root causes, which is something that Timo already addressed, is something that is almost entirely absent from the political debate in Europe, thinking about what it is that people are fleeing from. And again, to quote Dobler, I think he's very eloquent in this regard. He says, in almost every case, the African and Middle East migrants are fleeing wars, violence, or exploitation that are at least partly caused by Europeans, Americans, and their allies. The chronic underdevelopment of Africa, the protracted warfare in the Middle East, and the effects of climate change are all causal factors for the crisis, and all of them have their roots in Europe and its settler colonies. Put it provocatively. I'll amend it, say at least partly. So the short-term solution, so this is Daniel Renwick also arguing eloquently on this issue of the need to focus on root causes. The short-term solution is bleak. The people who will risk everything to find a better life than what they've been born into will not be assuaged by the threat of death or detention and deportation. In the long term, if Europe does not want to accommodate the masses of people who knock upon its door, it must start to address the underlying causes of migration. The moral indignation we all feel would be far better directed by addressing the causes of migration. That entails making our governments break away from the imposition of neoliberal orthodoxy through international financial institutions, and active mobilization against our government's open and proxy warfares in the Middle East, and a real attempt to limit the effects of climate change, vastly cutting our emissions. Any other solution is no solution at all. So that's to put an argument provocatively forward. Okay, so let me turn to talk a little bit more about what has been happening, because this is and the political dynamics underneath it. So basically, what we've seen in the last year, in particular, very disturbingly, is this acceleration of this fortress building. So between 2015 and today, and this was this map comes from a Daily Mail. Daily Mail is one of the worst tabloids in Great Britain. This was framed as Wall's work, showing what's been happening. But we've seen, in a knock-on effect, we've seen the construction of different walls to try to stem the tide, to build this border fence. On the other hand, there's been a lot of discussion and debate in Europe about sharing the burden of the refugees. And there's some truth in this issue, particularly with respect to Greece, for example. Greece and Italy, both are countries that are severely affected by the ongoing European economic crisis, Greece in particular. And so of the European countries that are on the front line, so to speak, of this fortress, these are the countries where the states are having the most difficulties in terms of their resources. And so there's been a lot of political negotiation with respect to how are we going to share this burden, because the legislation in Europe is such that there's a Dublin regulation that means where you come in and ask for asylum is where you can stay. So over the last year or so, this Dublin regulation has been effectively, at least aspirationally, trying to move beyond this towards some kind of refugee sharing. But this, of course, has been met by an upsurge of political protest, and has been seen as an opportunity, in particular, for these right-wing populist parties to object. Right-wing populist parties throughout Europe, but also an Eastern European bloc, which has voted against. So Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania all voting against the European authorities' plans to distribute some of the refugees across the European Union. Not Romania? Okay.
It's false.
Okay. All right.
Accepted.
Okay. Okay. Good. This was a. Okay. 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 Well, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. This is wrong.
Accepted.
Now, when it comes to the kind of rhetoric behind the positions of these Eastern European leaders, we see Czech President Miloš Zeman says, the reception of migrants from the Middle East and North Africa to the territory of the Czech Republic brings with it three major risks: spread of infectious diseases, terrorism of the Islamic State, and the creation of new ghettos. According to his opinion, the majority of refugees are actually economic migrants that are not fleeing war. The president also thinks that migrants that are crossing the Czech territory in order to go to Germany will stay in the Czech Republic when Germany eventually stops accepting them, which he says would then make Czech Republic to defend its boundaries with the police and the army. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who some of you may know, just last week pushed for a referendum rejecting European policies towards refugee sharing. He says, Europe's response is madness. We must acknowledge that the European Union's misguided immigration policy is responsible for this situation. Orbán also demanded an official EU list of safe countries to which migrants can be returned. He said that, quote, the moral human thing is to make clear, please don't come. Why do you have to go from Turkey to Europe? Turkey is a safe country. Stay there, it's risky to come. We could talk about Turkey a little bit more. And Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, he makes a somewhat valid point. He says, I have only one question. Who bombed Libya? Who caused problems in North Africa? Not Slovakia. So, Fair enough, I suppose. But this is some of the rhetoric on this eastern flank. Now, in general, I agree with what's been said here about Angela Merkel has been a shining light of liberalism with respect to the refugee crisis, and this has caused her serious political problems at home, as we know. But on the other hand, she's been involved in trying to push for this deal with Turkey, and this is a very complicated and problematic deal at a time where what we see in Turkey is an authoritarian crackdown by Erdogan and the humanitarian situation, the human rights situation for the refugees, even though Turkey has 2.9 million refugees, but the plight of the refugees in Turkey is far from good, as Jihad, who has personal experience as a refugee in Turkey, can speak to. So in a sense, this is the UNHCR declared this deal between the European Union and Turkey, where refugees would be returned from Greece back to Turkey, as a dark hour for Europe. And I think this is absolutely right. So let me just finish by talking a little bit about the political dynamics more generally, so as not to just hone in on what's going on in Czech, what the Czechs or the Hungarians or the Slovakians, but talk about. So we talk about Brexit. So this is a very famous and important propaganda slogan that I think was determinative in many respects of the Brexit campaign, in which you see this is Nigel Farage in front of it, and the idea that this is of all of these refugees coming to the UK. There's very few Syrian refugees in the UK, by the way, but nevertheless, this fear of these Islamic hordes invading was something that was rendered very salient through this image, and was part of the image on the populist right in Europe, and more in the UK, and more generally around Europe, of linking this to the European Union, the loss of sovereignty, and pushing forward the Brexit vote. It's not the only cause, but it's a very important part of this of what was undermining this, so underpinning the political dynamics. So let me just give a few more quotes on this. Nigel Farage, he blamed the EU and Germany in particular for giving huge incentives for people to come to the European Union by whatever means, and said that this would make deaths more likely. Additionally, he said that the EU Schengen Agreement on open borders had failed, and warned that Islamists could exploit the situation and enter Europe in large numbers, saying that one of the ISIL terrorist suspects who committed the first atrocity against holidaymakers in Tunisia has been seen getting off a boat onto Italian soil. Marine Le Pen in France, leader of the far-right National Front, which is looking very good in polls for the upcoming presidential elections next year in France, accused Germany of looking to hire slaves by opening its door to large numbers of asylum seekers, among a debate in Germany whether there should be exceptions to the recently introduced minimum wage law for refugees. Le Pen also accused Germany of imposing its immigration policy on the rest of the EU unilaterally. In Holland, Geert Wilders, another of these right-wing populist leaders, called the influx of people an Islamic invasion during a debate in Dutch Parliament, speaking about masses of young men in their 20s with beards singing Allah Akbar across Europe. He also dismissed the idea that people arriving in Western Europe via Western Balkans are genuine refugees, stating Turkey, Greece, Macedonia, Serbia are safe countries. If you flee them, then you are doing it for benefits and a house, he says. So this is the toxic political discourse that is taking off in Europe. And what do I mean by taking off in Europe? We can see in the European elections, and the European elections are a good indicator. There, of course, it's also a protest vote, the European election. So in some sense, the center has more of a chance of holding than can appear. But we see the UKIP, the Danish People's Party, the National Front, the Austrian Freedom Party, in Hungary, Jobbik, the Dutch Freedom Party, the Finns Party. All of these are making very impressive showings. In fact, at this point, a kind of Eurosceptic, xenophobic, right-wing bloc in the European Parliament is about a third of the European Parliament. And we see, as I say, in France, very dangerous. Austria, very dangerous at the national level. So we see a kind of mainstreaming of this position. And they also, these right-wing populist parties also pull the center-right parties to the right. You see this very clearly with the Tories in Britain, but more generally. So this is, so we have to understand what's going on here. What's driving this support for this what I say, inhumanitarian, xenophobic, racist response to the crisis? Well, one way to look at this from a sociological point of view is look at the social bases of support for these right-wing populist movements, and it's very disturbing what you see. In the United Kingdom, you see the UKIP has the most socially distinct base of support in British politics, which is why the party performs strong in certain types of areas. And the types of areas where they perform, where the percentage of white British voters is typically over 95%. So where there aren't very many migrants is where everyone's afraid of migrants. There are few ethnic minorities, middle class and graduate voters, so where there are few middle class and graduate voters. So it's taking off amongst a post-industrial, left behind native working class, so to speak, where average levels of education are low, and there are high concentrations of left behind, blue collar, and older voters who are most receptive. So that's in the United Kingdom. In France, we see similarly. There's one thing that's even more disturbing in France, which is in France, in the European elections of 2014, the Front National's vote was strongest, in fact, amongst the youngest voters. So that's extremely disturbing. What this right here is are two maps of France, one by municipality, one which is the levels of unemployment at the level of the municipality, and the other which is level of support for the Front National. So what we see is a kind of left behind. So this is linked to a secular long-term crisis of social democracy, and it's a kind of linked to what Dobler called the neoliberal equilibrium that has taken place, the threats to people's sense of security and the welfare state and the like in conditions of neoliberal globalization, which seem to be, it's in this condition that you have a kind of the latent xenophobic and racist attitudes become easily rendered salient in the political context. So let me just finish by looking a little bit about why this political message seems to be gelling, and it has to do with, as I say, attitudes that were latent. It's not like Europeans weren't racist and now they are, but that somehow those kind of racist attitudes, xenophobic nationalist attitudes, were left off of the political agenda or somehow marginalized them politically. But now what we see is, in fact, these right-wing populists are speaking to ways of framing things that have a genuine popular appeal. We could talk about the cause and effect here. But certainly it is the case that overwhelming majorities, this is according to Pew Global Research, disapprove of the EU's management of the refugee crisis. Fully 94% of Greeks, 88% of Swedes, 77% of Italians, and 75% of Spanish disapprove of the EU's efforts, and not for the reasons that I was criticizing, but because of the sense that they're being too generous and that this is somehow threatening. Roughly 7 in 10 Hungarians, Poles, British, and French take the same position. So to look a little bit more at this, the Pew Research people, they did a 10-country global attitude survey in spring of 2016, and what they found was that many Europeans are concerned that refugees will increase domestic terrorism. So there's a lot of concern about terrorism. And so this is a very interesting issue. So this is the second plank. So if the first plank for understanding what's going on has to do with this kind of the social conditions that are engendered in this neoliberal European context, the second has to do with the war on terror and the climate of the war on terror, and a kind of chickens coming home to roost in terms of people's fears. The fear is real. People are very afraid that the refugees are going to cause a big problem. And with variation across countries, but the median is 59% of Europeans that are very afraid that associating people, many of whom are fleeing precisely from the kinds of things that they're being targeted and identified with. And the other side of of it is that they are afraid that these refugees and migrants more generally will have a negative economic impact, even though, in fact, when you think about the welfare state situation with respect to migration generally, the Europeans have a problem with respect to demographically. They don't reproduce in numbers sufficient to continue to fund their welfare states. And so, in fact, the welfare states need an influx of migrant labor. So, but nevertheless, the way things get framed is it's concerned that that there's a shrinking pie, and these people are coming here and they're taking from us, and the refugees in particular, but migrants more generally. Now you see as well, when you ask, as I say, the second prong being this the toxic ideological climate caused by a decade and a half of warmongering, this Orwellian war on terror, which seems to create precisely the things that are being claimed to be fought against, is a sense that of when you ask Europeans, give a list of different things that are big threats to their country. ISIS is seen to be the top threat to the European countries. Now, in a relative perspective, if you're in Syria, if you're in Iraq, it makes sense to think of ISIS as a huge threat. But when we think about the numbers of people who've been killed, compare the numbers of people that have been killed by ISIS on European soil to the number of people who have been killed by cars in the last 5 years, so to speak. And where's the war on cars? So it's an irrational way of thinking about what the threat is. ISIS, 93% of Spaniards, ahead of global climate change, ahead of global economic instability, well ahead of cyber attacks. And well ahead of the large number of refugees generally. So it's linked in the public imaginary, as we saw in that Nigel Farage electoral propaganda, that there's these Islamic terrorist hordes that are invading us. So this is the ideological milieu, and it's something, again, to link it back to this issue. What's underlying this? It's taking root. This fear takes root amongst the left behind working class, and you see this very clearly across countries, that it's those with less education that are more likely to see refugees as a threat. So it's a very interesting kind of divide and conquer, so to speak, those left behind in Europe, pitted against. And in fact, in particular, there are two groups that everyone is afraid of in Europe, and it's the Roma, the Gypsies, and the Muslims. So this comes across very clearly. And underlying this then, and I'll end on this point with respect to European attitudes, is a deeper sense of a kind of what I say was a latent kind of nationalist, exclusionary nationalist sentiment, which has been rendered more and more salient in this context. So when you see very large proportions of people, much larger proportions of people thinking that diversity makes the country a worse place to live than a better place to live, with interesting variations across countries, but nevertheless, this is an idea that has a lot of salience amongst the European population. And again, it's something that is much more salient amongst those with lesser education. So those left behind are the ones that this is appealing to. So this is the popular base, so to speak, of this right-wing populism. So that's looking at the European perspective. And let me end, before turning it over to my friend and collaborator, Jihad Hami, to talk a little bit about the perspectives of the refugees. We've been doing some research on perspectives of refugees in Germany about the crisis. We asked them, what do you think about this European crisis? And we see very interesting, and I'll end with 4 quotes from refugees themselves. The EU is legally obliged to receive the victims of war. However, it is inhuman to leave the victims alone to pass the hellish road until they reach the territory of Europe. They, the EU, watch refugees as if they are watching a live race of struggling between life and death, and the EU watches in cold blood the episodes of the death boats that cross the sea and then look from long distance at how refugees cross very large distances and borders on foot. The partial solutions which have been taken recently by the European Union adds insult to injury, because we cannot rely on Turkey to reduce the flows of refugees. And I think Jihad will talk about that a bit. A second refugee adds, European countries are the real reason for the war in Syria because they cooperate with their allies in the Middle East who create terrorism. And here he's thinking of, in particular, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. They also do not go do their duties, such as the exercising of their humanitarian and moral obligations towards the refugees. To resolve the refugee crisis, European countries, America and Russia, must stop selling arms to armed groups and cut the financing of terrorist groups. Perspective. A third refugee says, I think the refugee crisis will not end as long as the conflict is still going on in Syria. Therefore, if we want to solve the refugee crisis, we must stop the war in Syria. And I would add to that that Syria is the focal point right now, but there are many failed states, and people where there are failed states, there are people fleeing. And a fourth and final refugee perspective, again, says, I think it is insufficient to solve the refugee crisis by accepting thousands of refugees. Therefore, I think the EU must play its humanitarian and ethical role to do its best to end this bloody war in Syria, and thereafter the refugee crisis can be solved. So that's to open it up a little bit to refugee perspectives, and I thought given the opportunity to speak about this, I'm from California, and I can talk about this issue from an academic perspective, but from a lived experience of a refugee, I think makes sense to, so I give the floor to you.